All right, welcome. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Ben Cheung. How are you doing?
All right. Thanks, Ken.
All right, this is going to be good. So this is the Something Venture podcast, and in this podcast, I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are changing the way we view the world online and beyond. And Ben is certainly trying to change the world. So let's do this thing.
Yeah, great.
So you're the founder of a company. I'm a little nervous about this not nervous, but a little worried about this podcast because I've tried to avoid having people on who start a company to talk about the company. Mm-hmm. The risk being that your company is like interesting, sort of like your kid's ballet recital is interesting. Like it's fascinating to you, and then for other people, like, okay, yeah, I think I've heard this like a million times. So we should be careful about this.
Sure. Yeah.
make sure it's entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that said, and it is kind of funny. I was talking to somebody today. I was like, when you describe your own company, it takes you forever. You're like, it's this and it's that, and this is nuance and all this stuff.
Right.
And yet, if you describe someone else's company, it takes you 2 seconds, right? If you're like, oh, HomeJoy is kind of, they come and they clean your home, and it's like on-demand home cleaning.
That's why it's the best way to find somebody else to get the tagline for your company.
it's pretty smart, right?
Yeah.
Like, just wait till someone else does it. So that said, you're the founder of a company called Genee. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And what? Tell us what that does.
Well, Genee is basically, it's like a virtual assistant that helps you schedule meetings. And, I'm sure many people would say that it's, recognize that, scheduling meetings is a real big pain point for people. And it's a huge mental burden, especially for people that does it a lot. For people like who maintain relationship with, external partners and clients, etc. So, so Genee basically offloads all that burden from you and just takes care of it by a simple command. So there's a lot of technology behind it.
And what stage are you at? Did you started the company already? It exists.
Yeah.
The product exists, I know, because we scheduled this meeting with Genee, and it worked.
Great.
So what stage are you at? Did you start it or?
Yeah, we started the company officially when we got funding around April last year. So we have been in deep development. There are a lot of technologies involved to make it right.
Yeah.
And we are just about to be, going out more publicly about it. We're like at the final stage of our beta.
Yep.
So we can't wait to have more people kind of start using it.
Yeah. And so what was the, we should talk about that in a second, getting traction, but what was so how did the fundraising happen? Is it a friends and family thing? Are you venture backed, or how did you?
We started with, of course, friends and family, and especially, ex-colleagues who have done well in previous jobs and who are interested in venture funding.
Yep.
And that seems like a common theme. If you get a nice exit, you suddenly become an angel investor.
Yeah.
So, we started that, and then, get enough momentum in that. Then we use the amount of money that we raised as a leverage, to kind of talk to the other more institutional investors.
Yeah, sure.
So I think that seemed to work out pretty well for us.
So what was the journey there? You left a successful. You didn't do it in your college dorm room. You were already successful before you started this. So what was your journey to this point where you're like, hey, I'm going to do this most ambitious of things and start a company, which is crazy. But but we've all done it, but it's crazy.
I mean, in all honesty, just living in Silicon Valley, I think there's just a lot of subconscious influence on you saying that, like, well, if you want to, be real and live the Silicon Valley experience, you should really just do like what some of the successful people did and start a company. I mean, there are a lot of subconscious things there. I would have to admit that it does influence me. Many people might reject that, but I think on the other hand, also, it's like after you have, worked in a large companies and, large and small, and some are successful, some are not, you kind of getting to a point in your life where you start thinking about like, how can I stretch myself a little bit more?
Yeah.
And how do I, go into a situation where I'm more vulnerable? And and let's give that a try, and maybe I can have a moonshot.
Yeah.
Kind of like, well, why is Google having all these moonshot projects? Because they have tons of money coming in and say, like, let's try something bigger.
There is something about Silicon Valley where it is. No one else in the world would do that. Like most places in the world, you don't just set out and say, hey, I have an idea. I'm actually going to go do it. Like I'm going to, you sit in a bar and you're like, we should do that. Somebody should make this thing. And then hear people do it. Somebody here, we're broadcasting from the Founders Den, which is a place where there's a lot of startup companies. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they said something about Uber. They're like, Uber exists because only in Silicon Valley would somebody have the nerve to say, I'm going to press a button on my phone and a black car is going to show up. It's like the sort of audacity of the concept is kind of crazy. So starting a company, you're at a point where millions of people in the world haven't gotten already having started your company.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a lot of people probably doesn't recognize this, but it's a kind of, you have to have some kind of, mental readiness or comfort in a way to think about starting a company. It's a privilege for us to be in Silicon Valley where the employment situation is so good, the economy is always constantly being good, that we have the privilege to think about bigger things. Versus like for me as a person who grew up in a third world country, when you're thinking about like how to get food on the table for your family, the next day you're not thinking about how do I press a button and have a car to show up.
That's right.
You're in survival mode rather than rather being like the Greek philosophers about thinking about like what is the meaning of life.
That's right. Where did you grow up? What was the?
I grew up actually in southern China, and I came over to the United States when I was very small, but very young. But I was old enough to like left a really good impression about what it's like when you're just fighting for survival and just trying to make the next meal.
That's right. And that is one of the great things about, if you ever listen to Bill Gates talk, he points out that he founded Microsoft in the United States. He's like, I didn't do this in Nigeria. He didn't do it somewhere where he was struggling. And Mark Zuckerberg didn't do it somewhere where he was struggling to eat. He was, going to Harvard, maybe struggling to get to class or something like that. But and in fact, on the podcast, some people have pointed out that there's a reason that people like Mark Zuckerberg found companies because they can take a risk because what's their downside, right? They're going to go be an engineer at Google, or downside is going to be they're going to work at Goldman Sachs. Whereas if you are somebody who's really struggled growing up, you're like, I'm going to take a stable job and I'm going to pay for my family, and life's a little rougher than it appears in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the things that people don't recognize underneath the surface of the entrepreneurship is that, a lot of times it's like you have to have certain level of comfort that you experience already and security. Then, therefore, you say like, okay, I'm willing to take this big risk because the downside is pretty low. And I think that's one of the things that people don't recognize, and I myself didn't recognize as much when early on, like let's say 5 years ago, I knew that like, hey, it's exciting to start a company, but I was probably more thinking about like, well, what happened to my finances and how do I deal with that? But now that after I be in the company, I look back and think like that's kind of wasted time to do that calculation because you're looking in Silicon Valley. What could the worst thing happen to you? Just get another job. And by the way, maybe Google will want to hire you now that you started a company versus where you worked in an old style company before. They wouldn't want to look at you.
Yeah. The Nassim Taleb, who wrote the Black Swan book, talks about the concept that actually people misperceive how safe jobs are. And his point is people who are like consultants who are kind of constantly getting their next gig in some sense have a safer job than someone who's been at IBM for 30 years because they're constantly understanding the market and making small adjustments and learning. And so if you can start your own company, you can probably get a job. Like you're probably not going to starve.
Probably not, especially if you get to a level you get VC funding.
Exactly. And so what was your path to, from China through coming to Silicon Valley, and what kind of companies did you work at to get there?
Sure, yeah. Could take all day to talk about it, make it brief. But
the big narrative.
Yeah, I came here when I was preteens and then, immigrated to Florida and learned English and, fell in love with computers, Tandies and
what was
Radio Shack.
Your first was a Tandy?
First hands-on was a TRS-80
Radio
Shack. And then,
they call it the Trash 80, right?
Yeah, Trash 80. Yeah, exactly. I knew people wouldn't get that joke. But, and then, just waiting tables and wash dishes and save up all my money to get the Tandy. I think it was 3000 SL, was $3,000.
That's fantastic.
And it has music, 16-bit sound,
wow.
color graphics. graphics, four colors.
Holy crap! 16 bits. That's amazing.
Yeah, 4 colors. Yeah.
Was there a Commodore anywhere along the way, or?
I think at that time was already past the Commodore age.
Was it?
Yeah, people started moving to these like bigger size computers now rather than hook it up to the TV.
And any gaming? Did you do any of the?
Oh yeah,
that's amazing.
I programmed gaming day and night, and then I tried to upload them to the bulletin board services, and my parents got really annoyed at me by hogging up the phone line for 4 hours to upload that like few hundred K file.
Oh, that's amazing. So you're like the guy, like you put yourself through, like you raise money to get your own computer, you work to get a computer, one of the early classic computers.
Yeah,
that's
I guess. Nobody else would give you money, so kind of just have to deal with it yourself. It's an American dream. That's really it at work. I'm the beneficiary of it.
That's amazing. And then so you ended up. That was a great time. So was the internet came along, or your access to it came along a little bit later? Is that right?
Yeah, I really first got access at Georgia Tech, and then when I got into a computer engineering program there. Right. So that's kind of wonderful. I guess myself being lucky got attracted to computers at young age, and then got into Georgia Tech, and then thank goodness Intel came to recruit at Georgia Tech, and got the job at Intel because at that time Intel is like Facebook and Google of today.
Course, yeah.
Intel and Microsoft at that time. So. And then there it just started the whole career. So and got my MBA, worked at VMware. Worked at Jive Software, and then finally started my company now.
All the big names. What? Who was running Intel when you were there?
Andy Grove was.
And was that like an amazing thing, or did you have any interaction with him? It is an amazing
experience, and they have a really, really solid, excellent culture. And from early on, I kind of can see that successful company, if you want to last, you have to have a very strong culture, and you can see that happening with Google and Facebook, and they all learning from the best. And I think Intel learned it from HP in the past.
Yeah.
So. And
Andy Grove was just like what's his book? Paranoid Survive.
Only the Paranoid Survive. Yeah.
And it's I don't know. I've heard him speak, and all CEOs are pretty compelling. That's why they're the CEO. But he's really compelling and a real no nonsense. I guess you're running Intel. You're going to be a no nonsense kind of guy.
Yeah. I mean, the culture of Intel is no nonsense. It's constructive confrontation, straight talking, and no BS. Just get the work done and results oriented. Yeah. And that's I feel really fortunate. I felt like it's grad school for me in terms of training me to be a good worker.
Yeah. And did something work out along the line? I mean, you coming from nowhere in China or southern China, at some point you're like, oh, I'm actually going to be financially okay now because of these Intels and VMwares and all that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, was fortunate enough to got into VMware pre-IPO and then Jive Software pre-IPO, nice. So done well. But as an immigrant, I think a lot of other immigrants could relate. You always have this fear, because you have exposed to so many new environments that you always want have your risk under control.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I really, really sufficiently comfortable that perhaps I felt like Mark Zuckerberg or some other people feel when they're more privileged growing up, that I feel comfortable enough. Let's do this, take the risk, and start the company.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, once I started, the risk profile is the way that it's being viewed is completely different.
Yeah. So what from the outside? Because there's a lot of selection bias in Silicon Valley, right? Mm-hmm. The companies that succeed, you hear about them and people talk about it, and the guys who just struggle, maybe they don't want to talk about it because it's rough. What did it feel like once you got into it? Where you're like, oh man, I shouldn't have done this, or it's more difficult than you thought, or how did you kind of feel about it once you got into it?
I think the biggest thing, maybe you start feeling very naive about a bunch of things because, the reality, the challenges start kind of piling up and you're learning to deal with it. And that's really the way that you can do it is approach when you get stuck in that situation. There are two ways roughly direction you can go with it. One is that you feel overwhelmed and depressed. The other way is you kind of saying that hey, it's a growing up experience for me. I'm really glad that I now given the chance, now that I can grow up.
Yeah.
And I can help myself to be more mature.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something about doing it, starting a company and that you do, you have to do everything. And I think you don't realize that in existing companies. And we get that all the time in my company. People ask us hey, who's your who does your billing? Who should I send the bill to? Or they'll be, who's your design team? And we're like, there's 5 or 6 of us. We all do it, and you kind of realize you have to do every little bit of it, and you have to raise the money, and you have to sustain paychecks for a bunch of people who are working for you or whatever, and it's a tough thing.
Yeah, there's just 1,000 things, million things to do. I think that's why one of the reasons why people like to start a company with co-founders is that when you have a co-founder and team, it really helps a lot. That you feel like you and the team's doing it together.
Yeah.
And so that you're not like alone, have to carry the burden of these millions of things that you have to do. The other thing I think is more severe that people are not prepared for, and I certainly felt that I'm not as prepared for. When I started, it was that like the mental burden of keep on kind of asking yourself, are we on the right direction? Am I doing the right thing? Am I prioritizing the right thing? I think that's a constant burden. And I talk to other co-founders, they say, that's the same thing. Like you're always wondering, am I on the right track? And am I, doing the right things?
Yeah. Yeah. Especially before you have, traction. If you have traction and your app's just growing left and right, you're like, okay, people probably like it. Before then, I'm sure you get, I know you get into situations where you think, well, man, this was such a great idea when I had it. I think it's a good idea still, but it'd be nice to get some evidence of that at some point.
Yeah. I think there's definitely that point because, the reality is that, most startups go out there suddenly on the first day. They put it out there and then everybody loves it and then they kind of just go crazy from that point on. Yeah. But it's a lot of different searching and it might be very possible that you search until you run out of money and you still couldn't find the product market quote unquote.
Yeah.
But usually there are encouraging signs of, different magnitude, and I think what I learned from my co-founder, I think really helpful very helpful is that he's gone through it multiple times, is that, you stay positive and you latch onto the little data points that you see and you keep following it, see where it goes.
Yeah.
And don't prejudge it, and also don't think about, that, it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
Or don't think that like, I need to know before I invest. No. You start investing when you see little detail. Maybe you see 10 people loving it that are recruiters, but you still go forward. Maybe at most it's going to grow up to 100, but you don't know that. If you don't try, you never find out. It's
interesting. Our company is going through we're going through a growth phase now, and it's great. And we're focused on growth. Like that's what we're doing. Like people love the product. That's step one. Step two is get it widely distributed. And what's really interesting is what you learn is there's a couple things where you shift focus in your Instagram and suddenly you take off. But most of what most companies never get traction, but the ones that most of the ones that do are just constantly doing things. Like they're putting experiments in the market and they're learning and they're learning and they're learning.
Yep.
And we've been doing that, trying to do 2 or 3 different things a week. And you're like, what we know today versus a month ago is just astonishingly different. Like things we thought were going to be great are losers, and things that we didn't really know are actually working pretty well. And you just have to be in the market, like trying things. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point and I also think about it, that's one of the things that many of us engineers background and to start a company, we are unprepared for this kind of thing because we always think about, okay, there is a problem and there's a process and you go to the formula and you solve the problem and you get the answer. But with the startup, it's kind of like what you said. It's a lot about the unknown is so overwhelming that you kind of have to do many different experimentations and see where it leads. There's not a straight path where you say like, let me just follow this recipe or formula and then it will go to success or not.
Right.
It's really dealing with the uncertainty.
Yeah. You said something interesting that I wanted to make sure we highlighted is that you really appreciate having a co-founder. I know people who are just who are absolutely convinced that it's almost impossible to succeed not having a co-founder. That it's such a difficult challenge, and there's frankly, an emotional component to it.
Yeah.
That you need 2 people in the sense that one person's like, they're just depressed and it's just kicked in the teeth. That the other person has, it's almost like pair programming in a sense, if you know what that concept is, where 2 people, the theory being 2 people working on a problem kind of accentuate each other, accelerate each other. And when you look at the individual founders, you have a few proto guys like, maybe Gates, but he had a partner, and Jobs. But even guys like Mark Zuckerberg, who appear to be doing it by themselves, there's like a Sheryl Sandberg, or there's some other person involved. it's almost impossible to go this thing alone, I think.
Yeah, I really admire the people who are able to do it alone because I really feel the benefit of having a co-founder, and I don't know how I would have done it by myself.
Yeah, and I think the alpha dog with the lieutenant works, like the Mark Zuckerberg and the Sheryl Sandberg works, and the Steve Jobs with Tim Cook and Johnny Ive, that kind of thing works. But yeah, it is not a solo endeavor, or it's tough to be successful as a solo endeavor.
Yeah. Also, a lot of times, what you view from the press as the alpha dog or solo, it's done because for some reason when you do PR and press, they don't like to have four different people being quoted and talk about the same thing. So they kind of pick the guy that's really good at talking and then have that person, and you think that person made everything happen.
Yeah.
But I think in reality, it's a team effort. It's not just the co-founders and also other people in the team that give suggestions, advisors, VCs that are helping, that kind of pull that knowledge together to make it happen. And even when we haven't made it happen yet, we're in the process of figuring that out, but I'm already seeing a lot of benefit of that. And, I think a lot of times the press really want to find that one single hero, but in fact, it's really work on multiple people. And that hero, maybe back in their family, in the company, might be just the little guy that listens to everybody.
Yeah. So how are you feeling about it now? Like, you're into this project, you've got a product, it clearly works. Like we clearly used it to set up this meeting. How does it, like, are you thinking I shouldn't have done this, or this is we're really on to something, or?
I think for the minimum, definitely feel that I've grown up a lot during the process, so there is no reason to not have done it.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't be the person I am today if I didn't do it. Regardless of the success, because I don't even know yet where it's going to lead. But I think every day I feel that there is still a lot of uncertainty. Just like the beginning. Before we got funding, we thought like, if we just got the money thing nailed, everything would come. People would, when you tell people they have money, they just come work here.
Yeah.
It's not the case. Whenever you knocked out a milestone, before it, you might think that you're all set, but then the next thing is bigger and harder.
Right.
For example, like, getting the product together, making it work and making our natural language component, which is really, really hard, to work. We thought that was really hard. And now we finally kind of got over the hump, and most people tell Genee to schedule a meeting. Genee understands. But the next thing is, how do I, where are the channels that I can get these users that I see traction in a very small scale? Where do I find these channels? And that turns out to be really hard. And you really also, the other thing is that you could spend a lot of money to buy stuff, but we can't afford it as a startup. So we kind of just have to figure out a way. So that's really, really hard for me at this point of the product. It's
a cool place. Oh, not cool. I mean, the first place is hard to get to, which is that anybody gives a damn about your product or that it even works. So once you're there, then the next thing is distribution, and all distribution all the time.
Right. Yeah.
And we kind of went through that where we kind of finally said, okay, people love this thing. We need to shift our focus now to making sure that they're sharing it with other people, that things are happening.
Right. And a lot of times it's also chicken and egg, because like, I've talked to some other early company co-founders when they're during the ideation stage, they think that is a naive, as simple as like, when I get the product to work, I just go talk to Google and tell them this product works, and they would just plug me in, and then I got all these users, and everything would be great. It's really not the case. I mean, you really have to constantly prove yourself. It's not simple as you get the product out there and then you get all these users.
Yeah.
So
it's amazing the complexity of building a company and taking it through an IPO or a sale, and the probability are incredibly low. And I think people really if you start doing the math on like how many companies get bought for $10 million or $20 or $50 million, say it's one every other day. It's like 100 a year, 200 a year. I'm sure this is a known number, and I'm saying the wrong number. But it's something not of the tens of thousands of companies that get started. And so people go into it with this huge sort of like, I think it's probably 50% going to succeed, and the real number is probably 1% it's going to succeed, or something like really, really grim or really far off.
Yeah, because people say that the people who buy lottery tickets are people really bad at math.
Yeah,
I think you can probably say the same thing about people who start companies are probably people who are really bad at math.
Yeah,
because
that's funny.
Because like you go through and you say, if you really sit back and objectively look at it, work out all the number with the probabilities, it's probably low. You're probably going to get less money than what you would have a stable job.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, don't fear that like your life is screwed when your company didn't go, because you live in Silicon Valley, so it's not a big deal. You might just 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 less. What is the big deal, right? So I would say, don't worry about not doing it, but it's really, honestly, if you're really like an accountant and you say, what's the ROI? Maybe it's a negative ROI.
Well, what's funny is you really do learn from having a company not work. And so if you get these people who worked at Facebook or Google, and they quit Facebook or Google to start a company, and like their companies kind of don't go anywhere. And it's because if you're at Facebook or Google, everything worked. Like what, you're the marketing guy at Facebook. What does that mean? Like if Facebook was great. The guy who was at a company that struggled and didn't work, but she's a hardworking person, they actually learned a lot. And so I think that's why you see companies kind of coming from guys who have failed a couple times. PayPal's this weird thing where all these people from PayPal were successful, but you don't actually see people quitting Google and Facebook really and starting super successful companies. I mean, Dennis Crowley with Foursquare, he wasn't really ever at Google. The Flickr founder who founded Slack wasn't really ever at Yahoo. Like, it's interesting. I think you learn more from struggling against it and succeeding or failing enormously. And then if you're an executive or a venture capitalist after that, you're probably better for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really true. I mean, like, just if I imagine myself being like a hiring manager or something in one of these big companies, and you're looking at a guy who have failed with a startup, and I think one way to look at it is that, hey, this guy have already made all the mistakes, and he won't be making these mistakes when he comes to my company, to working for me or for our company, and probably save us the money of that would be wasted because of these mistakes.
Yeah.
Now versus somebody have been in a very good environment and and being successful in a successful company, you're not sure if what they have really learned, and maybe they would be making all the mistakes that the guy that have done it would make on your dime, on your money.
Well, we're always puzzled too in terms of like efficiency and frugality. We'll go to a company, whatever, Facebook or something, and they're like, oh yeah, we've got 30 people on the iOS design team, and you look at the app, you're like, what do they? It hasn't changed a pixel in a year. Like, what are the 30 people on the design team like? What would 3 people do? Like, we can never. I know what 1,000 salespeople do, and I roughly know what 1,000 back-end engineers do. But sometimes you're like, really, you've got that many people? Like, okay, like I guess like you're a big company now, so the smallest number you guys can think of is like 15, people or something like that. Where startups are, 6 people. I mean, Instagram was, I think, 10 or 15 when it got acquired.
Yeah, I think from our experience regarding that topic about the design, and I really think you're right. Like, having a large number of people, I'm not quite sure if really what adds the value. What I find from my experience through the process, that it's really having the right combination of people with the different perspectives, or I would say different skill sets come together. For example, like how do you design a certain experience? Can you kind of meld somebody have mindset of growth, growth hacking, somebody have visual design, somebody have interaction design, somebody who understands the users, like a product manager, right? And somebody who knows a little bit about implementation and what is the best way to go about it. If you can just have such a unicorn person that can meld all these knowledge and experience into one person, I think that's what would yield the good product.
Well, and you look at guys like Michael Birch, who founded Bebo and sold it for $800 million. He was like that guy. Like, he would code, from the ground up, and so he'd have an idea, and he also had a growth mentality too. And the reason he's a billionaire is because having a growth mentality means you have to be a little bit aggressive. You can't be the guy who's like, oh, I don't want to, bother anybody or whatever. But at the same time, when he had an idea at 10 o'clock at night, he could just code it into the system between 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning, and then find out if it was working immediately.
Right.
And so his rate of learning, and the fact that he was networked into Silicon Valley with other guys who were at other companies like Tickle and Facebook and whatever, saying, oh, here's what we're doing that's working. If you put up a little thing that says, see who's on, people click on it and they invite their friends. Because he could do all of those things, that's why he's a billionaire.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what you get if you're that guy. It's that rare.
Yeah, I mean, like to have the good intuition to make the right decisions, trade off right away, or have the team that tight enough such that you can quickly get something out there to try, rather than the 30 designers who have to debate with the 30 growth guys all together to figure something out.
I am more and more convinced. I mean, everyone says this and you know that, but man, the quicker you're in the market and learning and making adjustments, it's almost like the whole game, in my opinion. Like just these phases, and we went through it, companies go through it, but this phase you go through where you're like building for 6 or 7 months, it's just brutal. Like, the quicker you've got something in the market and you're building because people are complaining about something, so you're getting rid of it, or you've tried something that people are loving, and so you're doing more of it. Man, the quicker you can get into that flow, the better off you are.
Yeah, I think so. It certainly helped us a lot in terms of like figuring out the priorities. I remember like when we first started, before we got funding, I told my co-founder that like, why don't we just have people like email Genee, and then I'll just read the email and I actually go and schedule the thing manually, but and I would type the words such that I sound like a robot. So that they think that they couldn't tell the difference.
Right.
So we kind of learned quite a bit from just doing that. I mean, it kept me busy because whenever I see an email, I immediately drop everything and then do the schedule, manually. But I think it's well worth it.
So what happens next for you guys though? When are you guys gonna be doing the fundraising, the lovely experience of meeting with VCs and all of that?
Yeah, I think it's coming up soon, not immediate. I mean, certainly we would need to kind of start going at it in the next few months, because I think one of the things with the startup, is that you always have very emphasis in short term. Once you get money, then you think when's the next thing that I need to get money.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's kind of Silicon Valley. So
now you have to find the right VCs.
Yeah, it's a long process, and people probably never done it. Don't get the impression, don't get appreciative how long it takes.
Yeah,
and different VCs want different kind of thing, have different risk profiles, and they have different hypotheses of what the market and which market this fits.
Well, that's a pretty interesting point. The James Currier, the great entrepreneur, said to me, and if I say this wrong, my apologies, but roughly, VCs don't invest in anything that wasn't already their thesis. So you're not going to walk into a VC and say, hey, Bitcoin is exploding and security for Bitcoin is going to be a huge market. Mm-hmm. And they go, oh, I never thought about that, but yeah, that's a big market and I want to invest. Mm-hmm. Like, the only way most VCs invest is they have a thesis. They're like, hey, technology is going to replace humans in all kinds of things, like scheduling meetings. Mm-hmm. And that's their thesis. And then you show up and say, I've got a technology. And they go, yeah, I knew it. Like, I'm smart. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the only way you get funded. You never introduce a new idea. Hey, healthcare is broken. You didn't know it. Now you know it. Like, that just never works.
Yeah, I think I myself don't have enough experience to say, but you've been to it many times here. But I see that kind of trend. I mean, like, I think the little nuance about it is that for the really early stage, and they call it pre-seed now because seed rounds are so big. Yeah. Pre-seed, kind of almost like super angel, early stage VC. Those, I find that they're a little bit more open. Yeah. They don't have preconceived notions. They kind of more interested in hear what you have to say, and they they decide to go or not to go. But for the larger ones that I had talked to, perhaps by mistake, on my earlier pre-seed kind of round, I kind of get the impression they do have certain hypothesis, and they were just evaluating whether we fit in or not.
Well, the funny thing too is you've got a technology. The funny thing about VCs is a lot of funny things, but one of them is that they think everything's going to be automated and replaced, except for them. Like, for them, you need an intelligent human being to do the investing. And so I wonder if VCs look at Genee and go, oh, well, no, you can't replace my admin. Like, my admin's like, perfect. And this isn't a problem because he or she, does this all for me. But
yeah, well, I think, the good thing about Genee is that we actually tell them that, like, the admin market is replacing existing admin is not as big as giving everybody in the world who can't afford a $70,000 or $80,000 admin an admin. Yeah. So that's much bigger than the number of people who have admins. So that's a market opportunity that you should think about as being in.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly solving a real problem. So how can we wrap it up here? But how do people find, like, okay, people want to try this thing out and maybe give you feedback if you're open to that? How do they track down Genee? We make sure they know how to spell it and all that before we leave everyone.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, of course.
Yes, people can sign up for Genee by just going to genee.me, genee.me, or if you have a meeting to schedule and you haven't even signed up, you can actually even CC Genee on your email without even signing up for anything, and we'll get you through the process. So the email address to CC is genee@genee.me.
Oh, that's cool. I love that. I use a thing called Wunderlist that got acquired by Microsoft. It's a to-do thing. And one of the things they have is you can just email the damn thing. It's great.
Yeah, this one is kind of, you have an admin standing by, just email Genee and then get a meeting schedule. Genee will talk to you and figure out how to connect to your schedule.
It's cool. Now that I'm thinking about it, there is a little bit of an Uber concept in there. And I know that's not probably how you put it, but the concept of, it used to be you had to be a pretty rich guy to have a private car. And then with at least the Uber black car came along and anybody could kind of have a black car. You kind of get to the point now where anybody can kind of have what appears to be an assistant setting up their schedules.
Yeah, for scheduling. I mean, the way that, it's a separate topic all itself in terms of AI and how sophisticated virtual, machines have become. But I think that we're at the stage where, like, we're the Roomba or iRobot. You can't have somebody as a robot as sophisticated as a maid that does everything in your house. But I think we can have technology that's advanced enough that you have a machine that only does scheduling part of the admin part of the part of the admin job for you virtually, automatically. Yeah. And the nice thing about computers is it's really fast and they don't complain. Work 24/7.
I like it. All right, this is good. I think we've done this thing. That wasn't that bad.
It's
fun.
fun.
We didn't bore people with the story of a company.
It's fun. I hope that my experience is useful for some of the people who are thinking about starting up. I mean, I think I certainly got a lot of benefit from talking to people who have been through it before, and then learn some more when I did it.
Well, and you've clearly kind of gone a long way from being in southern China and working on a TRS-80, to the most advanced technology possible here in the middle of Silicon Valley, which is sort of the capital city for technology.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting journey. And I think one of the things is that you kind of keep on have to improving yourself. I mean, I started with semiconductor. I could be still doing semiconductor today, but I chose not to. And I chose to, learn the latest and greatest thing and keep it up.
What a great path. All right, well, Ben Cheung, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you.
This has been the Something Venture Podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. See you later.